The goal of this video is to explain what an NRP is, how to play it, how to run it, and to help you decide whether or not you want to try it or not. So as the name suggests, NRP is simply for nation roleplay. It's similar to games like Civilization or Total War or the Paradox games if you want to compare them to video games. But it being a traditional game, it gives you way more creative freedom. You as the player. As the QM you don't get much. No. You have to live with what the players make. At its very core, the game has 3 rules regarding mechanics and a 4th rule which is more about fluff. So each player gets 2 actions per turn. Each action does one thing, and diplomacy is free, war counts as diplomacy. That's the very basic rule set. With the 4th extra rule, time is unspecified and character and nation time are separate. I'll get to the 4th rule first because that's the most esoteric one, I think. Basically, a turn or an action takes an unspecified amount of time. A turn is however long it takes to perform the actions. Sometimes actions are as simple as I built 2 farms. Sometimes they help you advance technologically drastically or expand. Those are things that time-wise could take anywhere from months to decades, logically speaking. That's why the length of a turn is time-wise unspecified. Character time is also completely separate. That's to actually allow meaningful roleplay, otherwise realistically you should have every character die every 2 turns or so. But people want to have their own characters, they want to have like a king, they roleplay with another one, a royal dynasty, stuff like that. Therefore the time and lifetime of characters is not tied to the nation itself, and in some cases you have the same guy ruling a nation turn 1 when it's in the Bronze Age and turn 80 when we are solidly in the Industrial Revolution and feeling its consequences. Each player gets 2 actions per turn, where 1 action does a single thing. That simply means that you can't phrase an action in a way that it does multiple things. For example, I build a wall and train an elite regiment to man it. That would technically speaking be 2 actions because you can take the elite regiment and have it do something else. So here comes into play the role of the QM, who says you build a wall and delegate elite soldiers to guard it, or you build a great wall. Next turn you can spend an action to train the elite regiment tied to it. That's the role of the QM in many cases. Further, the role of the QM can be extending additional fluff, like the wall is constructed, but during the construction works, your nation discovers a deposit of iron in the nearby vicinity. So it's saying that the action generally succeeds, but raining it down if the player tries to get too much at once, as well as helping to expand it further to give the player possible direction to develop their nation. Diplomacy being free is simply so players can engage in diplomacy with their nations without having to worry about action economy, start trade routes, etc. War counting as a diplomacy is a bit of an archaic rule, but it basically means that players handle wars without QM intervention if possible. That was more of a rule that helped to offload workload. And warfare is one of the most complicated aspects of the game, because it's really hard to do it in a way where everybody is satisfied with it, obviously. Nobody likes to lose. So in this version of the system, usually war was simply players debate with each other where it would be logical for one to win and where it would be logical for the other to win. Only really calling up the QM if either of them was stuck, if it got stuck where neither side could decide who would be the winner. So this is the basic NLP rule. When would I say when to use it? I would say to use it if it's the first game you're ever playing, or if the QM doesn't have a lot of time. That's because this is really, really light when it comes to workload. Games of this style I have played where there was 1 turn per day, every day. Sometimes multiple in a single day. because the game QM, Questmaster, will just come in, say, okay, all those actions succeed. For this one, you need to dedicate one more action to finish this. This one is too much. It can't go through. You have it refunded. Do something else with it next turn, and the turn moved on. And then the map is updated, where the maps used to be way more rudimentary back in the day, and that's why the workload on the QM was very low. The other upside of this is it's really simple to learn. One thing does one thing, and it always does that. And you can still roleplay for months that way if you really get attached to your nation. The drawbacks of doing it this way is that wars can become pretty toxic. I had cases where I spent days or weeks just arguing from morning till dawn with people over like conquering a small stretch of land, and very often wars boiled down to who was more consistent in their arguing, because obviously if there is no real stats, it's all about how well you can persuade or use arguments to tell the other guy, yeah, I should be the one who wins. Or if you can just annoy him long enough so he just looks like, yeah, whatever. And that's sadly how wars actually went very often. Another problem is how symmetrical this system is, because everybody has two actions and everybody starts with a blank slate nation. On paper, every nation is basically of equal power. This makes it highly problematic to wage war, because if a war is a 1v1, it will drag on forever, or it will be very hard to argue that one side should win over the other. Versus if it's a 2v1 war, it's basically always the side with more people winning, and easily so. On the contrary though, in cases sometimes where action economy is not kept track of so easily, the reason people win wars is solely on how they describe their nation. I was in a game once where I barely did military actions, simply because I couldn't have bothered, but whenever diplomacy came up, I described my nation as very militarily powerful, as my people as very good fighters. And simply because all the players went along with it, my nation was treated in game as very powerful, and because there was no stat system and the QM didn't even keep track of stats, I just simply kept winning wars. Which was a bit silly, but that's how it worked. And that's kind of when the system breaks down, when people start noticing these obvious flaws or start to try to exploit the simplicity. So what are some common sense alterations to the system which I would recommend even if you try to play it the first time? First of all, it's the 2 buildings per action rule, and to make some buildings obligatory. For example, farms being needed to sustain cities, markets being needed to create trade routes, and ports to create naval trade routes and have navies, as well as forts as defensive buildings, stuff like that. Create buildings that are necessary so players feel like they have to have it. That's because buildings are often a liability compared to actions that advance the technology or just straight boost the military, because a building can be destroyed, your spell can be taken away from you. And 2 buildings per action also helps to mitigate the bloat from it. The actions that are basically just I need to build buildings, stuff like that. Another rule that is often thrown out is the war counting as diplomacy. In this case, war, it's including a war in the action economy is generally very inefficient and just makes wars take weeks. Instead, often a system is implemented where each party describes to the game master what actions they want to take, and then either the GM decides simply who wins, or the GM decides what odds on a dice roll each side has of winning a battle, and the war proceeds from there. That's generally a better system of conflict resolution, but it does of course put more workload on the QM. And the last extra rule which I would recommend for a first time player is biomes have effects. It's a rule which helps to add a bit of depth and asymmetry to the game without suddenly adding a lot of complexity to it with it. Basically, mountains are more defensive, plains give more food, stuff like that. That can really help to make the game immersive without adding complexity. So you decided to run the game. how do we do that? First, you have to find players and ask them to submit their nations. A nation submission template usually contains a few things. That's how I usually organize a nation submission template. Name, and that's here goes the name of the nation. Then color, what color the nation would have on the map. Next comes capital name, what the capital is named of the nation, obviously. Race, what race the nation is. So usually that corresponds with a fantasy race. And here also goes a description of them. Are they just humans? If humans, what type of humans? It's also appropriate to often list their culture here and stuff like that. And then additional fluff. Here you list the history of your nation, its possible governance structure, its religion, stuff like that. Usually it's appropriate to not make this too long because just as in a D&D game, this is the story of your nation usually from the start. So it's supposed to not have already millennia of history where it like defeated God and shit. Okay, so your nation submission was accepted. Now your nation chooses a spot on the map. Let's say here, here, and here. And this is turn 0 complete, the setup. Now, when the first turn starts, very often the GM will give an intro blurb, so try to contextualize the place of the nations in the world. This is often done after the nations are submitted because he can then play off the lore of the submitted nations to some extent, and this signifies the beginning of the game. Now the players do their two actions. They have one tile each, so it would be reasonable to, for example, expand and build a city. Or if you are permitted to put multiple buildings in a single tile, I don't know, maybe build up an army so you can be safe, or a fort. After the actions are done, the QM evaluates the actions. The role in this case is to provide, mainly to provide plot hooks, or hooks for the nation to follow. If a player does an action and it's a very reined in action, like I expand one tile, then you say, oh, you try to expand one tile, you actually expand 3. Because that's the, I don't know, standard expansion speed. Or if a player goes overboard, and as the example with the wall before, says he wants to have multiple things with one action, then you say, you complete 1/3 of the project you set out to do, you can complete it with 2 more actions. And for example, if a player expands, you say, oh, you find a rare creature you could tame to have a strong mount, stuff like that. The idea is to give players ideas what to do with their nation if they don't have one. It's similar to improv comedy, if I had to compare it. Okay, that's it on that, I guess. Now let's presume you played an NRP once already, and this rule set was more than enough for you. The next times you play, it will probably seem incomplete or even a bit boring. There is other ways to spice up the game, which I would recommend. Not for the first time you play it, but for our next one, maybe. Or second, third, stuff like that. Such rule alterations would be, for example, so 6A would be starting turns. Starting turns is giving players 15 starting turns in which they can specialize their nation. So instead of having 10 turns of build-up, players already start with a nation that's somewhat built, which has buildings, which has an army, which has already invented certain magic, etc., etc. This helps to, from the start, help player nation take on a role in the world and prevents things from being samey. 6B is national wonders, national mysteries. This is having each nation have a unique national mystery or a unique trade good, which can never be copied or obtained by another nation. For example, you are the only nation in the world which has silk, and you are also the only nation in the world which has the Fountain of Youth. Silk would be in that case a trade good, while the Fountain of Youth would be a national mystery. This also helps to differentiate nations and keep the world from ending up all samey or all the nations doing the same thing. Further modifications to the game include getting an actual full-blown stat system and more complex things like adjacencies. In this game, to increase depth, I decided on an interesting design choice, which is all stats, or like all things the player has, have to be to some extent tied to buildings in the real world. That was to prevent magic from being overpowered, because often a problem with magic in this game is that if you build up an army based on having iron weapons and steel plate armor and stuff like that, the enemy takes your iron mine and you're fucked. Whereas if you build up a nation around having very powerful wizards which are very good at magic, then you can lose 3/4 of your country and not have even slight diminishing in your combat power. As such, in this game, magic was tied to ley points you had, and you could develop further types of magic by connecting ley points with each other, creating ley lines. Further, you could not just create an army and train it to be better. To have an army, you had to construct buildings, military bases, and forts, while to increase army quality, you had to produce goods for them, do wealth policies, money policies, stuff like that. I also, in this case, did one building per action, but building have adjacencies. So, for example, here we have a gold mine. This gold mine is on a tile that borders 1, 2, 3, 4 other tiles. As such, it collects 5 gold, not 1. While this farm, for example, collects 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 food, but because it's near a river, it collects further additional food. Furthermore, this game had preset resources to help with trade rather than randomly generated one or players just choosing what research they have. And while I don't consider the system in this game perfectly successful because it broke down late game, it was probably the most successful game I ran in a while. So what were the stats the players had to deal with? In my game it was food, production, presence, wealth, population, technology and magic, where technology isn't really a stat. Tech roll mod is the stat. Because technologies were randomly obtained and were outside of the action economy and were based on how many universities you had. And technology just said how many technologies you had. This comes in with the policy system. With actions you construct buildings, basically only buildings, while all the abstract things are handled through policies for which you pay for resources for buildings. For example, a trade route with another nation would be a presence policy, which is made possible by having a port. Port for a trade route over sea, or a market for a trade route over land. And establishing a trade route then cost presence as a presence policy. Whereas, for example, making javelins was a production policy, which included copper, let's say tin, production, wood, and magic. In this case, magic, because this nation had a boon where they could make magic crystals and put them into weapons to make them better. Wealth, on the other hand, is a bit of a jack of all trades stat, which can be used to enhance all things, but not by a lot, and is used as the general trade and exchange good. Well, food is just food for upkeep. Magic is used to make spells. To differentiate production and magic from one another, spells and produced goods functioned differently. If you, let's say, made 10 iron javelins, they didn't give a bonus to your whole nation. They instead could be used to equip 10 units and gave only a bonus to those. Well, if you made a magic spell, it gave a global bonus to your whole nation. Having a game like that definitely helped with nation diversity. I had one player which became very overpowered late game because he focused heavily into having good technology. I had another which did very great early game by focusing heavily into having maximum wealth, but dropped off and became pretty average by the end of the game because everybody had wealth at that point, and his nation became less relevant because he focused heavily on that, but he used his early game wealth to build up other areas of his country and had an overall pretty good country, but not very specialized in anything except wealth. But he had so much leftover wealth he couldn't do anything with, so he would just give it away to other nations to fuel their economy, and that way he had a very strong diplomatic network because no one could attack him because he was paying everyone. Another nation, I think it was this one, just focused on having very high population. It actually broke the game, so I had to slightly rewrite the rules. Well, this one was located on an inhospitable rock, but managed to become a regional power by heavily focusing into building up a strong navy. And that's, I think, is what is good about having a bit of a stricter system. The system should be built in a way where it doesn't restrict the player to what they can do, but instead rewards finding a niche and finding a theme to your nation. Rather than there being an optimal playstyle everybody follows, having specific natural resources, being located in a specific position, or being in a, like here on island, navies would, here were navies very important, here navies were not very important. Basically, a good system should not restrict actions a player can do. They should actually provide opportunities for them to be able to find a theme to their nation and for the world to become more interesting that way. Now to the drawback of this system. As you see in this game, I had 17 players. It took me between 6 and 8 hours every time I did the turn update to actually did it for every player, every turn. To update the Excel sheet and to update the map. And in between turns, I also had to obviously help manage wars and stuff like that, but that's more sporadic. So the time investment for a game like this, for the game master, is very comparable to having 2 properly long D&D sessions per week. Because doing it more rarely than twice per week will make the players forget about the game, in my experience, especially if you have 17 of them. Very often players will also have to drop because real life comes in when you have a lot of them. Another drawback is, because the game is freeform, unless you want to go out there and be like, no, you can't do that, you can't do that, the players will break the system. In this game, it happened twice. The first time, the pink nation here, the slimes, started having just putting all they had into getting the maximum possible population. And at that time, and the very early part of the game, they had a population of like 80, while all their neighbors had a population of 5 to maybe 50. Meaning that even if their neighbors got very good equipment and strong magic, there would just be no competition for the slimes. This led to problems down the line because I had to make magic and equipment way stronger. That was my first fix. It was not enough because they just kept pushing population. So my second fix was introducing the concept of standing forces and mobilization. Basically, it meant even if a nation had a population of 200, if they did not have a good economy, they could only mobilize really half of that population. Whereas a nation with a smaller population but a good economy could fully mobilize easily. As well as standing forces allowed to both respond to attacks quicker, and if you had a lot of them, they also were a good big military boon because of quality. They also helped nations which were reliant on equipment rather than magic, because if you are a nation with a population of 100, which by the late game most nations were, you're not gonna ever produce 100 spears, because that's 100 iron and 100 wood and 100 production. I don't think anyone I think one player by the end of the game had a production which would have actually allowed his full nation, his full army to be equipped with stuff like that. Yeah, it's these guys. Even they had a production of like 67 with a population of 80, so even he wouldn't have been able to equip his whole nation. The game was then broken another time by another player who maximized his population, but while maximizing his population he also went very heavily into magic. And because magic was global, it made his nation extremely strong. And they had to rework the system again for population to give malices to the economic side of the nation, which was a disaster, and I honestly feel like I should have not put that implementation in at all because it made the game worse, not better. That's because previously there was a fine-tuned system which meant that population would very rarely go over the pop cap, so the amount of food your nation can generate, unless you did some artificial population boosting. But because unemployed population reduced the amount of food produced, sometimes just your natural population growth would reduce the amount of food you had and put you into a famine. And that was... It's basically I fixed the problem of one player being too strong by making the game less fun for everyone. That's why I also won't publish the full rules for this one game and the Excel sheet for it, because I consider it a system I can do better. For the next version of this system, I plan to do something different. Instead of there being unemployment and stuff like that, there will be multiple castes to society. There will be slaves, peasants, wild men, middle class, and upper class. At the beginning, when the game starts, people will mostly start with wild men, and based on what buildings you construct or what policies you have, your population will start joining the specific castes, and that will help specialize your nation. Further, at nation creation, players will be able to assign certain bonuses or malices to their social classes. For example, unhappy peasants will by default always reduce the amount of food produced. But depending on but at nation creation you'll be able to assign if the middle class are the ones who produce weapons or if it's the peasants. And then it depends who you want to keep happy. Are all the clergy from the middle class? Or are they the upper class? Or are you playing a form of druidic nation, so the clergy are part of the wildmen? Stuff like that. And I think that will help to fix the population problem by not making it overpowered. But only next time I actually run the game will help. I think that's one. So, for the summary. Should you play an NRP or not? I enjoyed those games a lot. I've been playing them for years. And one thing I can say about people playing those games is that they are very willing to try new systems, even if this sounds something retarded you made on your own. What I would say you like in these games, if you like games like Civilization or Total War or Paradox games or city management games, if you like those, you probably would enjoy trying them out. Especially if you wish there was a way to play them, but to actually customize your nation and have them be something you like. Why I would not play this game? If you are someone who is a hardcore communist or fascist and wants to self-insert, I'd not do that. Those players are shite. Because you tell them, oh, your weird communist self-distribution plan fails, and they feel like you're actually insulting them because they are actual unironic communists. And if you tell them communism doesn't work in the fantasy game, they get pissy as hell. I guess the one problem to actually trying to play this game is I would not play it if you have less than 8 people willing to play with you. I would say that's the minimum. If there's less than 8 people, the game kinda stops being fun. And another big problem I would really watch out for the game is don't make the map too big. If the map is too big, the players will never meet. There's never gonna be conflict over resources. That's how my previous game ended. I made the map too big because I made expansion size dependent on population. And I counted that, okay, the nations with the biggest population would fill the map within a few turns, while the nations with the smaller populations would not expand out. What I didn't count for is that the nations who could expand very fast expanded once, had all the land they wanted, and then just didn't do anything with it, and just built resources there, while the nations with a small population did a lot of expansion actions because they also just wanted the land to have enough land to sustain themselves. rather than like outsourcing land or building on the land of the other nations. So that was more like a psychology error on my part. But in the end, it led to the fact that by the end of the game, after like 2 months, 2/3 of the map were empty. We still weren't out of the early game, and the game just died a natural death. So that's also something to watch out for. The game's generally a good alternative to something like D&D, where you need to actually everybody needs to meet up at a specific hour and be there to enjoy the game. This helps to be really flexible, because I can't imagine running a D&D game with 17 players. I can't imagine running it with 5 players and actually expecting everybody to show up every week. Because that's how people are. That's why maximum run for 3 people, 4 people. But with this, you actually don't really have to worry about people showing up or not showing up. So it does help if people have a flexible schedule. On the other hand, it can be a lot of work, especially for the GM or QM. You always need to be the one editing the map, and you need to be the one responsible for the players. And if you want to do a more advanced system like I did here, you also need to have an Excel sheet you update every turn. If you like nation management games and role-playing, then I think it's worth to at least give it a try.